Ava Collins watched the crystal glass fall in slow motion, knowing that in 3 seconds someone would die. Not from the shattered glass itself, but from what it represented in a restaurant where the wrong move at the wrong table could end a life. The 8-year-old boy's hand had trembled, knocked the water glass, and now it tumbled toward the marble floor while every waiter in La Vella held their breath. But Ava didn't freeze like the others. She moved. The glass exploded against the floor the same moment she dropped to her knees, her smile already in place, her hands already forming the signs that would change 3 lives forever. The boy stared at her with wide, terrified eyes, waiting for the yelling that always came, but instead her fingers danced in the air between them. "Hi Zero, it's okay. You're safe." The child's mouth opened slightly, processing what he was seeing, and then something remarkable happened. His small hands lifted, shaking, unsure, and signed back a single word that made Ava's heart crack open. "Sorry." The man at the table rose slightly from his chair, and Ava felt the temperature drop 10 degrees. Dominic Russo wasn't tall, but he filled the room like smoke fills a burning building, inevitable and suffocating. Every newspaper in New York had run his photo at least once, always with words like alleged and suspected, because nothing ever stuck to him. His son Eli pulled his hands back into his lap, the brief moment of communication vanishing like it had never existed. Dominic's voice came out low and controlled, the kind of control that suggested violence was always just beneath the surface. "You know sign language?" Ava stood slowly, keeping her body language open and non-threatening the way she'd learned to do when things got dangerous. "Yes, sir. My cousin was deaf. I learned young." She didn't mention that her cousin was imaginary, a lie she'd constructed years ago to explain a skill she'd actually learned for a different reason entirely. Dominic studied her face like he was reading a document, looking for forgery, and she kept her expression calm even though her pulse hammered against her throat. The other waiters had scattered, leaving her alone in the blast radius of whatever came next. Then Dominic looked at his son who was watching Ava like she was something magical, and his expression shifted into something she couldn't quite name. "You made him smile. No one's managed that in months." The rest of dinner passed in careful silence. Ava served their food, cleared their plates, and tried not to think about how Eli's eyes followed her across the room, or how Dominic's followed her even more. When the check came, Dominic didn't sign it. He stood instead, buttoning his coat with movements that seemed almost choreographed, and gestured for her to approach. Every instinct screamed at her to run, but rent was due in 4 days and her bank account had $200 in it. She walked over. "You want out of this place?" His question wasn't small talk. It was an assessment. Ava glanced around La Vella, at the other waiters who'd been working here for a decade, at the kitchen where the head chef screamed at everyone, at the manager who kept 40% of their tips. "Everyone does." Dominic nodded like she'd passed some kind of test. "Then come work for me. My son needs a tutor. You understand his world." The offer hung in the air between them, heavy with implications. Ava knew exactly who Dominic Russo was, what he was, and what working for him might mean. But then Eli tugged his father's sleeve and signed something she almost missed. "Please come back." She said yes before she could stop herself, and the smile that crossed Eli's face made her believe it might not be a mistake. Dominic handed her a business card that was blank except for a phone number. "Tomorrow morning, 9 a.m. A car will pick you up." He didn't wait for confirmation, just placed his hand on his son's shoulder and guided him toward the exit. Ava watched them leave, the card burning in her palm, and wondered if she'd just signed her own death warrant. But when she got home to her apartment with its broken heater and its walls so thin she could hear her neighbors' TV shows, she thought about Eli's face and decided some risks were worth taking. She called the number at 8 p.m. and confirmed she'd be ready. The car that arrived the next morning was black, expensive, and driven by a man who didn't speak or make eye contact. Ava climbed into the back seat, clutching her bag full of teaching materials she'd stayed up all night preparing, and tried not to think about all the people who'd gotten into cars like this and never been seen again. The city slid past her window, getting progressively wealthier, the buildings getting taller and more spread out, until they finally stopped at gates that looked like they belonged to a fortress. The Russo estate sprawled behind iron bars and stone walls, beautiful and cold like a museum where someone had forgotten to add warmth. Inside, the mansion felt empty despite being filled with furniture. Ava's footsteps echoed on marble floors as a housekeeper led her upstairs without speaking, through hallways lined with paintings that probably cost more than Ava would make in her lifetime. They stopped at a door covered in crayon drawings, the only sign of life in the entire house, and the housekeeper knocked once before leaving. Eli opened the door himself, and the smile that spread across his face made the whole terrifying morning worth it. He signed "You came," with such pure happiness that Ava felt something in her chest unclench. His room was enormous and filled with expensive toys that looked barely touched, like someone had bought everything a child should want without asking what this specific child actually needed. Ava sat on the floor and started simple, using picture cards and sign language together, letting Eli lead the way. Within an hour he was laughing, a sound so rare that it brought Dominic to the doorway. Ava didn't notice him at first, too focused on Eli's joy, but when she finally looked up, the expression on Dominic's face stopped her cold. He wasn't watching his son. He was watching her watch his son, and something in his eyes looked almost like grief. The days fell into a pattern. Morning sessions with Eli, lunch in the kitchen with staff who never quite met her eyes, afternoon walks in the garden where Eli would sign about birds and clouds and everything he noticed. Ava started to understand that Eli hadn't always been nonverbal, that something had happened to steal his voice, and the household tiptoed around it like a landmine they'd all agreed never to mention. At night she heard things through her bedroom door that she wasn't supposed to hear. Dominic's voice, low and dangerous. Other men's voices, nervous and quick. Words like shipment and cleaning up, and what Vincent started floated through the walls. Vincent, she learned from careful eavesdropping, was Dominic's father, and everyone spoke about him in past tense with voices full of fear. 3 weeks in, while tidying Dominic's study because the housekeeper was sick and someone had to do it, Ava found the box. It was labeled for shredding, filled with old ledgers and contracts from decades past, the kind of paperwork companies kept because lawyers said they had to. She almost didn't look through it. Almost. But then she saw her own last name, Collins, written in faded ink on a folder tab, and her hands moved before her brain could stop them. Inside were payroll records, audit requests, and financial statements spanning 3 years. Michael Collins, her father, had worked for Russo Enterprises as an accountant. Not a thief. An accountant. Her father's signature appeared over and over, always on audit requests, always beside notes about discrepancies requiring investigation, and transactions needing verification. And stamped across every single one in red ink was the same phrase, closed by Vincent Russo. No explanations. No follow-ups. Just closed, buried, forgotten. Ava's hands shook so hard she almost dropped the files. Her father hadn't stolen from the Russos. He tried to investigate them. And then he died in a car accident that police had ruled suspicious but never solved, and his name had been dragged through every newspaper as an embezzler who'd gotten what he deserved. Her mother had died 6 months later, broken by the scandal, and Ava had been 15 and alone and convinced her father was a criminal. But he wasn't. He never was. She confronted Dominic that night, walking into his office without knocking, files clutched against her chest like armor. He looked up from his desk, surprised, and that surprise turned to understanding the moment he saw what she was holding. "My father worked for your family." Her voice came out steadier than she felt. Dominic set down his pen with careful precision. "He stole from them." The lie sounded practiced, rehearsed, like he'd told it so many times he'd started to believe it. "No." Ava threw the files on his desk. "He tried to stop them." The papers scattered across the mahogany surface, evidence spreading like an accusation. Dominic stared at his father's red stamps, at Michael Collins's signature, and something in his face crumbled. He didn't deny it. He didn't defend it. He just looked haunted. "You shouldn't have gone through my files." His voice was quiet, almost sad. "Then maybe you shouldn't keep ghosts in your desk." Ava turned and walked out before he could respond, before the tears came, before she fell apart. She made it to her room before the sobs started, pressing her face into her pillow to muffle the sound because she didn't know who was listening or what they'd do if they heard weakness. Her father had been innocent. Her father had been murdered for trying to do the right thing. And she'd spent 8 years believing he was a monster while working for the family that destroyed him. The irony would have been funny if it wasn't so absolutely devastating. She packed her bag with shaking hands, deciding to leave in the morning, to walk away from Eli and his father and this whole nightmare. But then she thought about Eli's smile, about how he'd signed, "I love you," to her yesterday, and she couldn't make herself close the suitcase. The decision was taken from her 3 hours later when the windows exploded inward in a shower of glass and gunfire. Ava hit the floor on instinct, her ears ringing, her mind struggling to process what was happening. Shouting. Running footsteps. More gunfire, close and deafening. She crawled toward her door, then heard a sound that made her blood freeze. Eli crying somewhere in the hallway. She ran without thinking, finding him crouched outside his bedroom, hands over his ears, tears streaming down his face. She grabbed him and pulled him into the nearest room, a study with a heavy couch they could hide behind. Her hands moved in signs even as bullets chewed through the walls above them. Stay small. Stay silent. Daddy's coming. Eli buried his face in her shoulder, and Ava wrapped herself around him like a shield, making herself as large as possible, making herself the first thing any bullet would hit. The firefight felt like it lasted hours but was probably only minutes. Ava heard Dominic's voice, sharp and commanding, coordinating his men. More gunfire. Screaming. Then silence so sudden it was almost worse than the noise. Footsteps approached their hiding spot, and Ava tensed, ready to fight with her bare hands if she had to. But it was Dominic who rounded the couch, his suit jacket torn, blood on his cheek from a cut, his eyes wild until they found his son. Then found her. Then saw how she was positioned, her body covering Eli's, protecting him even now. Dominic dropped to his knees and pulled them both into his arms, and Ava felt him shaking. "You should have run." His voice cracked on the words. She pulled back enough to look at him, at this dangerous man who was holding his son like he'd almost lost everything that mattered. "So should you." The words came out sharper than she intended, but true. Dominic laughed, a broken sound that wasn't quite humor. "I can't. This is my life." He looked down at Eli, who had finally stopped crying, and something in his expression shifted into determination. "But it doesn't have to be his." The aftermath was chaos controlled by people who'd clearly cleaned up violence before. Ava sat with Eli in his room, both of them wrapped in blankets, while armed men swept the house and Dominic interrogated the one attacker they'd taken alive. She learned later that the assault had been targeted specifically at Eli, a message to Dominic from rivals who wanted to hurt him where it mattered most. But someone had leaked the security layout, the guard rotations, the weak points in the estate's defense. It was an inside job, which meant someone close to Dominic wanted him destroyed. The house became even more tense, everyone a suspect, everyone watching everyone else. Dominic barely slept, spending his nights in Eli's room or pacing the hallways, trying to figure out who betrayed him. Ava found him 3 days later in his office, surrounded by files and photographs and security reports, looking like a man being buried alive by his own investigation. She decided to stay for now because leaving would put Eli at risk and she couldn't bring herself to do that. But the tension between her and Dominic was sharp, a blade neither of them wanted to touch. He looked up when she entered and she saw exhaustion written in every line of his face. "I found something." His voice was rough from too much coffee and not enough sleep. He pushed a file across the desk toward her and she recognized the name on the tab. Robert O'Reilly. The same signature that had appeared on her father's cancelled audit requests. O'Reilly had been Vincent Russo's right hand, his enforcer and his cleaner, the man who handled problems that needed to disappear. He'd retired years ago, supposedly, living quietly off his substantial pension. But Dominic's investigation had traced the security leak back to him, to a burner phone and encrypted messages that proved he'd sold the information to Dominic's enemies. Why would a man with money and safety risk everything for revenge? Dominic had asked him that question personally in a room Ava didn't want to think about. And O'Reilly had talked. "Your father found something." Dominic's words fell between them like stones. Evidence of money laundering through human trafficking. Women and children being moved through legitimate business channels. "My father's operation." He paused, gathering himself. Michael Collins was a good man who threatened to go to authorities. So Vincent made him disappear and framed him as a thief to protect the family name. O'Reilly helped. "He's the one who tampered with your father's car." The room tilted. Ava gripped the desk to stay upright. "Why are you telling me this?" Dominic looked at her with eyes that held too much guilt to meet hers directly. "Because you deserve the truth. And because I need you to understand that I didn't know. I was 17 when your father died. My father told me he was a criminal and I never questioned it. I built my life on that foundation and it was all a lie. The confession sat between them, heavy and impossible. Ava wanted to scream at him, to hate him, to blame him for sins that technically weren't his but felt like they should be. But she saw real horror in his face, real guilt, and she understood that he was a victim of Vincent Russo too, just in a different way. What are you going to do? Her voice came out smaller than she wanted. Dominic pulled out another file, this one thick with legal documents and business contracts. I'm dismantling it. Everything my father built on blood. I'm going legitimate even if it costs me half my empire. And I'm setting up a trust fund under your father's name to compensate the victims we can find. He looked up at her finally. It won't bring him back. Won't fix what happened. But it's all I can offer. Ava sat down heavily, her legs giving out. She'd expected denial, defense, maybe even threats. Not this. Not accountability. Not redemption. You'll make enemies. Dominic laughed bitterly. I already have enemies. At least this way I can look at my son and not feel like I'm raising him to become a monster. He stood and walked to the window, looking out at the estate where Eli played in the garden with 2 armed guards watching him. You taught him how to speak again. In silence but still. You showed him there are people in this world worth trusting. I think it's time I learned how to be quiet about my father's sins and loud about my own choices. The transformation wasn't instant or easy. Dominic had to navigate a world where going straight made him a target from both sides, where the law didn't trust reformed criminals and criminals didn't trust reformers. Businesses were sold. Partnerships were severed. People who'd worked for the Russos for decades found themselves unemployed or, in some cases, arrested when Dominic turned over evidence to federal investigators. Ava watched him age years and months, the weight of becoming a good man somehow heavier than the weight of being a bad one. But through it all he never wavered. And through it all Eli kept getting better. 4 months after the attack, Ava sat with Eli in his therapy session, the same session he'd been attending 3 times a week without progress for over a year. His therapist was patient and kind, using every technique modern psychology offered, but Eli remained locked in silence. Until today. Ava was showing him flashcards with words and corresponding signs when he suddenly pushed them away, frustrated. She waited, giving him space to work through whatever he was feeling. And then he opened his mouth and sound came out. Not a word yet. Just sound. But sound was everything. His therapist's eyes went wide. Ava's heart stopped. Eli tried again, his face scrunched with concentration, and this time it was clear. Dad. Dominic, who'd been waiting outside as always, heard it through the door. He was inside the room in seconds, dropping to his knees in front of his son, tears streaming down his face without shame or apology. Eli said it again, stronger now, more sure. Dad. Then signed it too, as if the word needed both languages to be complete. Dominic pulled him close, his shoulders shaking, and Ava had to look away from the intimacy of it, the raw love and relief. When Dominic finally pulled back, he looked at her with an expression she couldn't quite name. You did this. She shook her head. No. You did. He needed to feel safe enough to speak. That was you. But Dominic reached out and took her hand, the first time he'd touched her since the attack. You made him believe he could. That's everything. The months that followed were quieter, gentler, as if the house itself was learning to breathe again. Dominic's legitimate businesses flourished in ways his illegal ones never had. Turned out that operating without constant fear of arrest was good for profit margins. The trust fund in Michael Collins's name grew, helping victims that Vincent Russo had destroyed, and every check that went out felt like a small piece of redemption. Ava watched it happen from her new position as director of the Russo Foundation's communication program, teaching sign language to children who'd experienced trauma. It was meaningful work, the kind her father would have been proud of, and she threw herself into it with everything she had. Eli became her assistant, demonstrating signs for the younger kids, his own trauma giving him patience and understanding beyond his years. He spoke more now, though he still preferred signing when emotions got too big for words, and Ava understood that completely. On weekends, Dominic would join them at the center, this feared businessman sitting on the floor with crying children, learning to sign comfort and safety in home. Watching him, Ava saw the man he might have always been if Vincent Russo hadn't poisoned everything he touched. And sometimes when Dominic looked at her across a room full of healing kids, she saw something else too. something that made her heart beat faster and her breath catch and her carefully maintained walls start to crack. 6 months after Eli spoke his first word, Ava found Dominic in the garden at sunset, watching his son play. She sat beside him on the bench without asking, their shoulders almost touching, and they existed in comfortable silence for a long moment. Eli had made a friend, another boy from the center, and they were teaching each other games that mixed sign language with spoken words, creating something entirely new. I used to think silence was power. Dominic's voice was quiet, reflective. That not speaking, not showing emotion, not letting anyone in made me strong. He turned to look at her and she saw everything he wasn't saying written in his eyes. Sometimes it's peace. Ava's response was just as quiet, just as true. They sat together as the sun set, painting the sky in colors that felt too beautiful for a world that held so much darkness. But maybe that was the point, Ava thought. Maybe beauty existed because of the darkness, not despite it. Maybe redemption was possible even for people who didn't deserve it, and maybe healing came from the most unexpected places. She looked at Dominic, this man who'd dismantled an empire to become someone his son could be proud of, and then at Eli, this child who'd found his voice again through trauma and trust. And she thought about her father, about how he tried to do the right thing in a world designed to punish goodness, and how his daughter had somehow ended up here, completing the work he'd started. Dominic reached over and took her hand, the gesture tentative, asking permission. She didn't pull away. They sat like that as darkness fell and stars appeared, two people broken by the same evil, healed by the same love, watching a child play who represented everything they'd fought for. In the distance, Eli laughed, the sound carrying across the garden like music, and Dominic squeezed her hand gently. No words were needed. Some things were better communicated in silence, in touch, in the space between heartbeats where understanding lived. The past would always be there, carved into their bones, but the future stretched out ahead of them like an open road. And for the first time in years, Ava believed they might actually make it. Together. All three of them. A family built not on blood or obligation, but on choice and forgiveness and the radical act of becoming better than they were yesterday. The night settled around them, gentle and complete. And somewhere in that darkness, three ghosts finally found rest.